Welcome to West Coast Focus, sponsored by photographer Kim Cohan and Telemetrics Network Construction in Marina. I'm your host, Steve Zmack, and today's show is all about pushing the wet darkroom. About 10 years ago, digital photography began to rival film. New avenues of creativity were being explored in the digital world that couldn't be traveled with a film camera and wet darkroom. Many analog photographers had no interest in abandoning their time-honored craft, but questioned how would they stay competitive in an art world that seemed to be moving on. The answer was to develop new printing techniques using traditional materials in new ways and new combinations to create prints that were beyond the capabilities of their digital counterparts. The darkroom dwellers push back and push back hard, and I'm excited to show you the dynamic originality of 6 photographers who are taking the West Coast tradition to new places. Our first guest has been a passionate photographer since childhood. She has a degree in Russian language and literature from the Monterey Institute of International Studies, has worked as a translator in Washington, D.C., led photography tours in the Soviet Union, and received grants from Polaroid to make pinhole photographs of Leningrad in winter. She's a recipient of the Imogen Cunningham Award and has taught photography at Monterey Peninsula and Cabrillo Colleges since 1992. Her photos are in the collections of many museums, including the Boston Museum of Fine Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Stanford Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and J. Paul Getty Museum, and has published 4 books. Explorations Along the Imaginary Coastline is my favorite and continues to influence my work today. She's the ambassador from the Alternative Process Nation. It is an honor to have Martha Casanave in the studio today. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you.
Experimenting and pushing photographic boundaries, never fearing to break rules, is the credo of our next guest. She's won awards and exhibited in galleries, museums, and universities throughout the U.S. and Europe, including New York, L.A., San Francisco, London, Paris, and Smolensk. She's included in the collections of Women in Photography International Archive, Beneke Library at Yale, Schlesinger Library at Harvard, Smithsonian Museum Library, Crocker Art Museum, Triton Museum of Art, and Monterey Museum of Art. She's studied with Ruth Bernhard, Joyce Tennyson, John Sexton, Brian Taylor, Elizabeth Opelink, and Martha Casanave, just to name a few. I became addicted to her imagery in 2003 after seeing one of her pinhole landscape prints, and she's been a positive influence on my creative pursuits ever since. It's great to have Jane Olin here.
Thank you very much.
Our next panelist is a lifelong photographer and 5th-generation California Central Coast native with degrees in engineering and music from Stanford and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. She's been shooting with the same Nikon for 27 years, above and below the sea, and exhibiting her work since 1999, including an underwater photography exhibit at the Center for Photographic Art with the 3 guests from our underwater episode 2 months ago, and was just in an exhibit with today's 2 panelists that we'll be talking more about. Her prints are in the collections of the Monterey Museum of Art, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Mariners Museum in Virginia. I've been fortunate to exhibit alongside her in many local group shows. It's finally great to have my longtime friend, Robin Robinson, finally on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi, Robin. Before we immerse ourselves in the mind-blowing artistry of these photographers and their advanced techniques, it's time to review some darkroom basics with award-winning photographer Zach Weston as he walks us through the making of a silver gelatin print. Let your eyes adjust to the safe light as we go straight to the Weston Darkroom at Wildcat Hill in Carmel Highlands.
How's it going? My name is Zach Weston, and today I will be demonstrating printing silver gelatin print in a wet darkroom. We are currently in my father Kim Weston's darkroom, and I will be printing an image from a Spain workshop we did in 2015. It's called 11N. So the first step is to put the image in, or the paper in the holder. And beforehand I got all of the grade and the timing already down and ready, so this image is shot at a grade 3 and it will be exposed for 23 seconds. And on this particular image, there's a little bit of a hot spot down in the right corner, so what I'm going to do is give it a little more time. So I will give it about 10 more seconds in that bottom corner just to make sure that get some detail in the white bottom. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Great. Now the image is ready to be developed. Set the timer for 3 minutes. And I usually agitate the paper, every 15 seconds. Some people do it differently. It is a practice that I learned from my dad. That's how he does it. It's really great to see the image come out, to see it appear really slowly. It's a pretty magical thing. The paper we use is Ilford warm tone, and that's what my dad has always used, and that's sort of what I was taught on and learned on, and that's what I've gotten used to. My dad is a proponent of knowing and mastering your materials. So it's, you have a developer, you have a paper, you have a film, and you stick to it, and you learn it, and you master it, so you know what you're going to get, and it's not a guessing game. So I mean, at his stage, he knows exactly what he's going to get before he even takes the picture. I'm definitely not there yet, but I understand where he's coming from, and so my goal is to use the same materials he uses and just to master the technique. So it's sort of second nature. It's almost done here, about 15 more seconds. I like to take it out a little early, about 5 or so seconds, because it drips down. It's still developing. Then into the stop bath, which stops the developing process. And it goes into a water bath, and then into the fixer. And we have 2 trays for fixers, each get 4 minutes. So a total of 8 minutes in the fixer. And for a finished print like this, try to have it in for about a minute or so before we turn on a light to look at it. So it's been about a minute, so I'm going to turn on the light. On this light, let it drain a little bit, and stick it up here and get a good look at it. So this is the time where I look at the print, make sure everything is in the print that I wanted, everything has detail in it, nothing's too dark, too light. Just pretty much an overall inspection of the print to make sure it's what I really want. So this bottom area right here is what I was talking about that I burned earlier. So just a really hot spot, and that's probably just from me when I was taking the picture, didn't meter on this little spot, which was a little brighter than everything else. So I just burned that in a little bit just to give it a little bit of detail, so it just doesn't look whitewashed. Yeah, so that would be a finished print. I'd put it back in the fixer for about 4 more the rest of the time, and then another 4 minutes, and then it's into the wash. And then I would wash that for about 10 minutes, hypo clear it, and then wash it again, and it's ready to go, ready to be dried. And that's how you make a silver gelatin print. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach, for that printing demo. And now let's kick off our discussion about pushing the wet darkroom. Let's start with a quote from Gail Enns, the curator of your recent Sand City exhibit titled Independent Presence, about your photo group, Salon Jane. They have emerged from the strict confines of the prevailing view and training which has dominated the Monterey Peninsula for generations, each developing her own independent style and vision. Can you talk about how that statement applies to each of you? Let's start with you, Martha.
Okay, well, first of all, I just must say, thank you, Zach, for that great demonstration. But as we can see by that demonstration, that the role of women in the tradition of West Coast photography has been more as model and, if I may say, mistress than as photographer. So, in a way, we all break the tradition by just being women.
With a camera in your hands.
Yeah, women photographers. Okay, so, but I came to the Monterey Peninsula first to study Russian, as you said in your introduction. And I was photographing at the time, but I was not like an aware photographer. I wasn't really aware of the tradition here and of all the great people that were living here. I have always been primarily a portrait photographer, an indoor portrait photographer. So I wasn't part of the tradition that was doing the rocks and trees and the landscape and the seascape and everything. And I got to know many of those people simply by asking them if they would sit for me so I could make a portrait. That's how I got to know Ansel and the Westons and a lot of those people. So
seems like a similar approach of why I have this show is because I get to meet so many great photographers.
There you go, yeah. Yeah.
Jane,
Yeah.
what do you think?
Well, I started photography later in life. I had a career before photography, and I migrated to Monterey Peninsula College to take photography classes. And at that time, in the late 80s, early 90s, it was all straight photography. You had to be very precise about your prints. You had to have a zone 7 highlight and a zone 3 shadow. And I took all of that in. And I didn't really think about it too much at the time. I was just excited about being in the dark room and being photographing.
You must have had Henry Gilpin for a teacher.
I had Henry Gilpin, and he was fabulous. He was so encouraging. And so I learned a darkroom technique, and I learned the zone system. But as soon as I got my own darkroom, I started experimenting and pushing the boundaries of that straight photography. And I love being there. And most of the creative work that I do is in the darkroom. I start with an image that I make, but I manipulate. I do what I need to do to create the image that I envision, really.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm always pushing the darkroom materials and just experimenting. I started off experimenting with different techniques.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Robin, how are you busting out?
Yeah. So I learned the zone system and black and white printing really well from mentors and people up at Foothill College and City College San Francisco. And I was always comparing my prints to Ansel's or Brett's and Imogene's. And at some point I decided that it kind of wasn't enough for me, for my expression, and that I wanted to be more mystical and less literal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started adding color and took alternative process classes to try to create more of a painterly effect in my work.
Mm-hmm.
So I do straight printing like everybody else does with those chops that I learned, and I really appreciate and I'm grateful for those techniques that I learned.
Mm-hmm. And if I can follow up, beyond a straight silver gelatin print, what was the first advanced technique that took you into a new place in the darkroom?
I can't really say, but I just have to say I took an alternative process class, and it was like in a whole new world. It was like opening up this candy store, and I just had to do everything and try them all, and I still do that. and take workshops in different techniques. So it's all really fun.
Jane, how about you? Where did you dive in and to do the extra?
It actually was with my very first portfolio, I would say, because I was taught that you had to have a zone 7 and a zone 3, and I decided, you know, this calla lily that I'm making, I want it to be light. I want it to have that almost paper feeling. So I just went ahead with that, and that started my evolution, really, to experimenting with different things. And I wouldn't necessarily call it an advanced way of seeing. It's just a use of experimentation and trying things and see what works for me as an artist, because I do most of my creative work in the darkroom.
Now, your first portfolio, you used a pinhole camera for that.
Actually, that was my second portfolio.
What camera did you use for your first portfolio?
Just, I started out with a 35mm camera, and then I moved to a Pentax large 2.25 camera.
And then the 4x5 pinhole.
And then I went to the 4x5 pinhole.
And that's where I started to catch up with your work.
I think so, yes.
Martha, what about you? Where did you go crazy in the darkroom?
Well, I don't know. I think I always have. Since a very early age, I've always done photograms, which is cameraless work done in the darkroom, placing objects on light-sensitive paper and exposing it to light. I've always done those. I've always been fascinated by cameraless photography. Back in the 70s, I was doing what I called pastagrams, because I was throwing around cooked and uncooked pasta on photo paper. And then I started adding a little bit of Parmesan cheese to that. You know, I always had a good meal after these sessions, by the way. And then I just started, I liked the effect of the cheese. And then I just used only the cheese. And I did a whole series about the symbolism and the mysticism of the Hebrew alphabet, making the letters out of cheese.
Very creative.
But I still do photograms today. I mean, just...
And you've added to that the photogram process by introducing new chemicals beyond the traditional what would be used for a photogram.
Yes, well, then I began doing photograms with cyanotype and other things too. So, yeah.
So okay, let's switch gears. And what is your favorite place to be? Is it in the field with your camera? Is it in the studio with your camera? Or is it in the darkroom making the print? Or none of the above? Robin.
Definitely for me, in the field, because if I'm in the field, that means I'm either in the water or on the water, and that's like my happy place. I like the darkroom. It's quiet, and there's a kind of funky time warp that happens in the darkroom where you think it's been an hour and it's been 5 hours. So I like that, but I would much rather be in the water with my camera. So,
Jane?
Well, you know the answer I'm going to give you. Definitely the darkroom. I love the experience of being in the darkroom, and for me, it develops into a dance. I'm working with the chemicals, I'm working with the image, and I introduce experimentation all the time, and that always stimulates me. And another thing about being in the darkroom for me is that I'm absolutely in the present moment. And that is very fulfilling to me, to just be with the print and be there and be able to create something that's unique.
Martha?
Darkroom.
Darkroom.
Yeah.
In every which direction.
Yeah.
Good. I think for me it's being in the field. And in the digital world where you shoot huge quantities, it just means there's more to look at when you get back to the office. So I really like, same as you, landscape nature photography. I go to my happy place. That's where I feel the most spiritual. That's where I go to church. And that's where I like to be. Okay, so now it's time to see some of the great photography that we've been talking about, and we'll come back to this discussion in a few minutes. Now for your viewing pleasure, we have slideshows of photography from Martha and Jane set to the original guitar work of Pacific Grove's own Bill Specht. Enjoy. Welcome back to West Coast Focus, and our subject today, pushing wet darkroom. Martha, we saw some of the third part of your slideshow there, explorations through the fabricated microscope.
Yeah.
What's the creative drive behind this? What's the darkroom process behind it? Is it a completed body of work, or are you still adding to it?
Oh, this is one I've just kind of started, so it's not completed. No, it's ongoing. I don't know how long it'll last, but so the story goes that I've collected my tears all of my adult life, and in little tiny vials, and then I take a dropper and I put one drop on a microscope slide, put the cover on it, store it in the slide boxes, and I put a date on them. I don't put on it what caused the tears. And then I decided just very recently, why don't I photograph those? So I began to photograph them. And then I got interested in photographing other things. So right now, the body of work is provisionally titled Explorations Through a Fabricated Microscope, a Compendium of Tears and Other Things. Because I'm working on other things too.
Wow, that's...
Some of those were other things. They weren't all tears.
That's fascinating. And that's cameraless photography?
It's all cameraless.
Wow. And do you have an idea of what the finished print is going to look like? Or is there some sort of lack of control, like when making a watercolor painting, where you just kind of let things go and see what abstract
in experimental
shape
work,
forms?
there's always lack of control.
Uh-huh.
And that's the magic of it. That's what we like about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay. And if you want to know how those were really done, the tears start with a 19th century process called cliché vert, which a thick piece of glass is held over a candle until it's thoroughly sooted and black. And then I let it cool and put a drop of either denatured or isopropyl alcohol on it from a height, and let it dry, and I put that in the enlarger and make a print of that. Those are the tears.
I'm stunned at how you came up with this.
Then the other things are objects, small objects that I place on clear plastic, clear flexible plastic, with most often with aloe vera gel, and I fold the plastic over and I put that in the enlarger, and then I make a negative of that on ortholithofilm. Then when those are washed and dried, then I enlarge those as prints, as positive prints. And those are the other things, the little eggs you saw, the eggs in the sperm cloud, the vermiform life. That's how those are made. So they're all cameraless and very experimental.
Yeah, well, I think you're really onto something. Jane,
Yes.
Your work, where I know when you submitted your bio to me, you told this story of serendipity of how a discarded print in the darkroom started sort of taking on a life of itself. Can you tell us that story, and then tell us how you refined the process to get those prints?
How long do you want to be here? Well, I was working with some stick negatives that I had made in Havana. Mm-hmm. And when I do work prints, I use, I work very fast. And so I was working with several negatives, changing them, and then I thought I made a mistake. So I put the paper, silver gelatin paper, in the developer, and it didn't come up. So I just threw it at the end of the darkroom sink. And I worked the rest of the day, light on, door open, and as I was cleaning up, I turned that print over and thought, oh my God, I love that. So, of course, at that point, I didn't know that I was going to create a body of work around it. So I put it in Fixer and put it in a black bag because I wasn't sure whether it would be a fugitive print or not. So I would say a couple of weeks later, I took a little look, and there it was. So at that moment, I decided, I really like this, and it's so experimental, and it's so different from what I had been doing previously.
Or anything we've seen before anywhere.
So I decided I'm going to figure out how to do this. And I love experimentation. So the Odyssey started, and it took quite a while to develop a technique to accomplish that work. And but as Martha said, I have no control, really. I have to be very present with the print and process. I have to react to it and do other things with it. And it's an 8-hour process. So I go into the darkroom interacting with this print many, many times. And of course, I'm under a safe light. So I don't really know until I take it out into my studio what I have. And it's always a real celebration when I get a print that I love. There's a lot of stacked up prints that belong in the garbage, but when I get that one that I love, it seems all worth it. Definitely worth it.
Do you work on several prints simultaneously through that 8 hours?
I started with one, but I do now 6 because I can get 6 in my darkroom sink at a time. So I'm working with the 6 prints, looking at them, adding. I might add a developer via paintbrush. I might add a developer spraying. I might drip developer. I move the developer on the print. So I use a lot of different techniques, and of course a lot of things I've tried that didn't work. But I'm always, even now when I do those prints, I'm trying something new. I think I'll try this today. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Robin, you paint the chemicals onto the paper, you splatter the chemicals onto the paper. How many different types of chemicals are you typically using, and how much control are you giving up on that final print?
Actually, it's only the developer that I'm spreading onto the paper, so it might look like other stuff, but thankfully it's only one chemical. And I use different brushes. I use toothbrushes, spray bottles. I've even used like a squash that I cut in half and dipped in developer and spread around. So kind of anything goes. And then after they're dry, I paint them with dyes, so there's some color.
Okay, well, we're at about the halfway point, and I want to show you some Palladium prints from Robertson Parkman. I know Robbie from the Image Makers of Monterey, and he shoots 5x7 film for a completely analog process, but he also integrates digital cameras and digitally printed negatives. So check it out, and we'll see you back here in 2 minutes. Welcome back to West Coast Focus and our discussion on pushing the wet darkroom. And this show would not be possible without the generosity of our sponsors like photographer Kim Cohan and his company Telemetrics Network Construction in Marina. We need sponsors for our upcoming programs, of which we have many. If you're interested, you can get all the details at stevesmac.com. So let's get back to the discussion on pushing the wet darkroom and more of a philosophical point of view about the West Coast tradition of photography. Is it more about the subject matter, humans and their relationship to nature, or more the mechanics, the traditional analog process of a black and white print? Martha, what do you think?
Well, I would say subject matter is really prominent here just because of our landscape. And it attracted so many people to come here. But also, technically, I think the straight print was very much part of the West Coast tradition. So it's a combination of both.
And where do you see that evolve to today? So with the mechanics, the introduction of digital photography, if the subject matter is still, West Coast in nature, is it fully with the West Coast tradition, or does it really have to be both the subject matter and the mechanics, or is it just the mechanics regardless of the subject matter?
Go ahead,
Jane.
I really think that the traditional West Coast nature photography, the artist wanted to say something about the nature and that we need to preserve it, Yosemite, but the precision of the print and the beauty of the print and the preciousness of the print was really important to really exemplify that. So I think they come together, and great example, all of Ansel Adams' work. I think he was in precision when he was making the photographs, and he was in precision when he was developing and printing them in his darkroom. And I think both of them meant a lot to him. As far as the new technology is concerned, I have witnessed absolutely gorgeous prints that are digital and printed on a digital printer. So, and I think they're still after that beautiful, beautiful print. They go hand in hand, really.
Robin, what do you think?
I agree with everything these guys said. But basically, I think what's missing is there's a camaraderie and a sharing and a mentoring that's part of West Coast photography. And people maybe outside of that world don't know about it because you don't see it in a print. But that sharing is really important, and it definitely exists still today, especially here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that is an important tradition in the West Coast School of Photography. Is that we're imparting the knowledge, we're imparting the craft, we're sharing it with our peers, our mentors, and those just coming up in photography. I think the West Coast tradition, it's really it's the tradition, it's what began this movement in photography. But jumping back, we're using printing processes that predate F64. And we're using new technologies, and technologies are always going to be expanding. Ansel Adams adopted color photography, and that's a step, right outside the original West Coast tradition. So I think the subject matter, the same thing, is that it grew out of this movement, but now it has a life of its own, and it's all like the descendants of that movement and where we take it. So jumping back to the educational component, you guys have come up with some great techniques. How can we learn from you? Martha, you teach at Monterey Peninsula and Cabrillo College. Do you have some classes coming up to cover this stuff?
I'm in a class right now that's a portrait class, but every spring I teach alternative processes, which are mostly, I must say, all these processes are mostly historical, so they go way back. The kind of chemical work that Jane is doing and that Robin is doing, maybe not quite so much, but most of the other alternative processes that I teach anyway and that I practice go way back to the 19th century. So yeah, I love teaching that. That's my favorite class.
Jane, where can we learn from you?
Well, I must admit I'm not a teacher, so my thinking process never goes in that direction of sharing my ideas and my way of creating these pieces. But if anybody were interested, I would certainly share what I do and how I do it with them. I have no compunction about that, about sharing my artistic vision with anybody that's interested.
And let's talk about Salon Jane. Is this named after you?
Salon Jane, absolutely.
So you started this group. Tell us about the group. Who else is in it? You just had an exhibit in Sand City. Is this the first exhibit by Salon Jane?
No, we had our first exhibit, Gail N's Gallery, on Lighthouse in New Monterey. It's no longer there, but we had a wonderful exhibit there, great turnout. And then our last one was in Sand City, a very short exhibit. And our next exhibit is in Gilbert, Arizona, Art Intersection. And we're going to have a panel discussion about our work, so that would be another opportunity for people to hear about our work and our techniques. And the three of us are in the salon, and Robin Ward, and she's doing some really interesting work with the drone, with the camera and the drone. It's fabulous work. And there's Anna Ream, and she concentrates on family and exploring that whole idea of extended family and the relationship to her. And then we have our wonderful artist, Susan Hyde Green, who starts with a pigment print, but she does some extraordinary things with it. She cuts and pastes and sews and adds words, very intriguing work. So we're all, in the salon, we're all pushing the boundaries of what a photograph can be, really. And that really excites us.
Well, I'm sure the viewers
from
really
old to
excited,
new,
too.
from historical work and primitive, simple work to like the quadcopter photography.
Right.
So
We
And
cover it all.
we meet at least 4 times a year just to share work and support each other too. So.
Well, who were your influences and mentors coming up, and who continues to influence you today? Go ahead, Jane.
Well, for many years, my husband and I traveled all over Europe and Japan and United States on business. And I would always find myself in a museum, in galleries, just looking at art. And I realized very soon that there weren't many women artists out there, at least being displayed. And so I just kept on doing the business that we were doing, but it was sort of in my mind, golly, I wish I could find some great woman artists. And I landed on Georgia O'Keeffe. She was very visible. I liked her work. And so I said, hooray for her. So she was certainly an inspiration to get involved in being an artist. And then there was Imogen Cunningham. I had great respect for her journey, but also her work. And Ruth Bernhard was a great photographer, and she inspired me. And then our own Martha Casanev has always inspired me my whole career with her beautiful work.
Okay. Well, we're going to finish this answer and discussion when we come back, but I have some more photography to show you. And this is normally where I would show a slideshow of my photography, but sadly, I do not push the wet darkroom. Today's subject matter photography is outside the bounds of what I do, but my friend Greg Metler has agreed to show his photography as my proxy. Like Martha, Greg teaches at Monterey Peninsula and Cabrillo colleges, and his name came up a lot during our last episode on the Weston Scholarship, where all of our guests cited him as a major artistic influence. So now for your viewing pleasure, we have Robin Robinson's photography, followed by Greg Metler's photography to the original music of Bill Specht. We'll see you back here soon. Thanks, Greg. I think I chose my proxy well. Okay, let's continue our discussion, pushing the wet darkroom. We're talking about our influences, where we draw inspiration. Robin, where are you coming from?
In terms of inspiration, I grew up watching black and white television, and I was totally into film noir and the all-time great Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is a great movie. The underwater sequences, and it's just fantastic. So I do like science fiction and surreal images. Currently, I'd say I like the work of people like Ted Orland and Sandy Skoglund, Bill Brandt. I like film from David Lynch and Guy Madden, and I really love electronic music mixing.
Martha, the well for your ideas.
Well, it's all over the place. I'm very project oriented. So each project has like a different inspiration. There was one project I did of pinhole work when I had a studio. It was all in the studio. And I used my friends as actors to set up scenarios. So each picture had a story. And those stories were inspired by my own memories, by their memories, by literature or a painting I saw. There was one picture, I'll just give you an example. A friend of mine got married and took her husband's name. And I said to myself, oh, another woman disappeared. So I said, idea for a picture. So I got a guy in a tuxedo with a loosened bow tie in the foreground, and way in the background was a woman in a wedding dress. It's a long exposure with pinhole, and she's moving, so she's just a ghost.
Wow.
But every project has a different inspiration. The microscope work is inspired by 19th century photomicrography, which I just love, and I saw in a show in San Francisco, and I have the book, and it's just wonderful. So
yeah. So surrealism. You all have surrealism as a theme in your multiple bodies of work. See, but whatever direction you run, surrealism still plays a part in that. What draws you to portray the world in this way, and how does your traditional process contribute to your vision of surrealism? Go ahead, Robin.
So I'm interested in the idea of seeing and feeling but not knowing. And there's a tension in that scenario that really interests me. And I think the surreal image can carry that through, making something that's just basically not real or fictional is what I'm all about. Mm-hmm. And my process, I add color, I add special effects that might contribute to that effect, and make something other than the thing itself.
Jane?
Well, the surrealism has fascinated me for a long time. I have the idea of getting beneath the veil of reality and showing something else. And the surrealists were dependent on chance in their work, and they were very interested in tapping into the unconscious. Mm-hmm. And how I do that is I definitely watch my intuition, and I trust my intuition and just go with it. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. So that's basically how I like to work. And with the crow images, I was trying to capture the essence of a crow, and that energy that has attracted cultures and people for millennia. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I was after with the crow, mm-hmm. Manipulating that, mm-hmm. and trying to capture that little essence of what a crow really is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The spirit of the crow.
Yes.
Martha?
Well, I think as these two wonderful photographers have already said, that surrealism has a lot to do with chance, experimentation, and expressing something below the level of reality, below the level of consciousness. And I think that's what we're all doing in a way. Mm-hmm. But again, I think experimentation is at the heart of all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I like to introduce surrealism into my work, but more in a straight approach of the subject matter that I'm photographing. I'm trying to get into like a deeper level, a way of seeing it that isn't just looking down at the ground at that rock, but like, what does that rock represent? What could it be? And what's the history of that rock all the way back through the cosmos?
Wow.
So I like to explore it that way. You use the term darkroom alchemy in the statement about the exhibit Independent Presence. Can you describe what this term means?
So alchemy is taking materials and transforming them into something else, something more perfect. And so in the darkroom, you're taking chemicals and prints, or I'm sorry, paper, and making prints. So you're fundamentally changing these elements into a new thing. And during that process, it's quite magical. It can be spiritual, and the end product might have changed you as a person. So that's alchemy, and I think the darkroom is something available to us right now, where we can practice alchemy like people did way back when.
Turning something into gold.
Yes, exactly.
Jane, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think she expressed it very well.
Well said, yes.
Yeah, I'd say so too. And I'm seeing that term, and when I was researching the subject matter for today's show, I saw that term popping up a lot, but I had not heard it before looking into this subject matter. So I think that's probably something we'll be hearing more about as your prophets of the traditional darkroom continue to take your word to the street and get your prints out there and describe the mind-blowing process in which you use to create your work. Okay, so now it's time for Reflections in the Developer Tray, and this is the segment of the show where I like to leave you with a little something extra to think about until our next show, which won't be coming along until December. Now, if your mind isn't already bursting at the seams, it will be. The artwork of Monterey Peninsula College and Cabrillo College art instructor Beverly Rayner integrates all kinds of photography, from tintypes to iPhone images to X-ray negatives, and goes beyond photography to combine other materials. You can't talk about it, you just have to see it. That's our program. Thank you, Martha, Jane, and Robin.
Thank you.
Thanks to Zach Weston for his printing demo, and thanks to Greg Metler, Beverly Rayner, and Robertson Parkman for sharing their photography, and Bill Speck for his original music, and Michael Martins directing the show from the control room, and of course, a huge thank you to our sponsor, Kim Cohan and Telemetrics Network Construction. We'll be taking October and November off to produce the next batch of 3 shows, which includes Jerry Ullsman's Influence, Monterey Bay Photo Clubs, and the long overdue Landscape and Nature Photography. AMP will be rerunning our first 6 episodes on our regularly scheduled times on Thursdays and Fridays, so you can catch up. And you can always view past episodes at stevesmac.com/West Coast Focus TV. And as always, you have my word, you will see at least 100 photos per episode. May your blacks be rich and your highlights full of detail. Thanks for focusing on the West Coast. Now get off the couch and push some boundaries.